Okay, so thank you again, everyone, for being here today. Real quick, for those who are not familiar, the Northern Rockies is part of a network of 15 regional fire science exchanges that are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. We facilitate knowledge exchange among managers and scientists by bringing people together to strengthen collaborations, synthesize science, and enhance science application to critical fire and fuels management issues. And today we're very excited to be hearing about some research from Charlotte Reed. Charlotte is a PhD candidate at the University of Montana studying how fire impacts tree physiology and drought susceptibility in Western Montana conifers. So Charlotte, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Darcy. And thanks everyone for being here on a Monday. I'm excited to talk about some of the work that I've been doing for my PhD. And I just want to start by acknowledging my collaborators and funders here at the bottom of the screen, in particular, the Joint Fire Science Program. Their GRIN program has funded a lot of my work. So I will just go ahead and jump in here. So we know that the dynamics of both fire and drought are changing in our forests across the Western US. This is not surprising information, right? The frequency of droughts is increasing and droughts are becoming more intense. And as a product of this, and also a bunch of other things, including warming temperatures more generally, we're seeing drier fuels, larger fires, more area burn, longer fire seasons. You add in the complication of human ignitions and expansion into fire-prone landscapes, and then a century plus of fire suppression as well. And particularly
Charlotte,
in,
I'm so
oh,
sorry. I'm
yes,
going to introduce.
that's okay.
I think somehow you are presenting on one screen and sharing the other because
Okay.
we're just seeing, we're
Oh,
not seeing your presentation in present mode.
oh, that's no good. Let's see here.
Sorry.
That's okay. Let's see if we can. Um, is it not moving forward? Is that the problem?
It's not moving forward. It's just in the, like we can see all of your slides on the left. Um,
Hmm.
it looks like you haven't hit present on it.
Interesting. Okay. Well, it's up on mine. Still not showing.
No, but now I see your mouse moving, so maybe now we're on the right screen here.
Let's see here. I can try stop sharing and resharing my screen. Sorry about this.
Yeah, you might have shared the presentation instead of the screen.
Okay, let's see here. Let's just go ahead and try this again. Sorry, folks. Um, let's just try sharing the whole screen and we don't need to see that. Does that look better?
There we go. That looks like
Good.
it's, yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks. All right. Well, we'll get back to this picture that I was painting here, about how the dynamics of both fire and drought are changing in our western forests, and this is particularly true in these kind of lower elevation, mid to lower elevation conifer forests where fire was historically frequent, but where a century of fire suppression has led to increasingly dense forests. So forests that are more vulnerable to both wildfire and also drought, because if you have denser forests, more competition for water in particular, which can be an issue during drought. So the important thing to consider is that even in these really big burned areas, there's a lot of areas where fire either doesn't reach, so leaves some trees unburned, or where you get some level of fire injury, but the trees at least initially survive. And so when we think about fire injuries, we primarily think about crown scorch and then injuries around the base of trees. So on the left here, I have a picture showing some trees from a prescribed fire that have some crown scorch, so this is just heating of the needles, kills the needles. This can also include needles that are consumed, so dead needles that remain on the tree afterwards. And sometimes if the fire is hot enough, that can result in the buds being killed on those branches as well. So particularly in trees that have smaller buds like Douglas-fir, generally when you see crown scorch, that means those buds are killed as well. Whereas ponderosa pine, which have much larger buds, they're a bit more resistant to fire, to heating. And so those branches, even if they have crown scorch, are often able to put out new needles after fire. So that's one type of fire injury. The other, I'm sure folks have seen plenty of examples of fire scars on the landscape. So this just happens when fire gets hot enough to kill both the phloem and the cambium where growth occurs, so that tree is not able to grow new cells to cover up that injury. And these type of injuries, we primarily see them around the base of trees, but they can happen in branches or even in roots as well. So I've kind of laid out this picture here where we have fire impacts. So that could be, for example, from fire injuries that can result in trees dying in the years after fire, or in those trees recovering. And so if those trees do go on to survive, the question is then, do they recover this kind of pre-fire function? Are they able to grow like they were before the fire, or is that function reduced? So are they actually growing less? Are they more stressed? And then what happens when you add drought into this equation? So we have this kind of interaction where we have fire-injured trees, and that can be from wildfire or prescribed fire. And at the same time, we have more or hotter droughts. But at the same time, it's really important to consider the fact that fire can also have this thinning effect on forests as well. So if fire is thinning out the forest, does that increase water availability for the remaining trees? Is that kind of benefit able to offset the impacts of these injuries? And so this has kind of been one of the overarching questions of a lot of my dissertation work. It's something that I get really excited about. So do we see any evidence that fire could actually decrease the vulnerability of trees to drought? Well, we do in some cases. So this is some work from the Southern Sierra Nevada in California, showing the proportion of trees that died from that big drought they had a few years back there on the y-axis in both burned, so these are sites that had been repeatedly prescribed burned in the gray bars, and in unburned forests in the white bars. And then these are just across different diameter classes. But what we see here is that the proportion of trees that died is less in these areas that had been repeatedly prescribed burn. So suggesting that this thinning effect of the fire is able to benefit these trees under this really extreme drought. But other studies have not found this benefit, and some studies, even in the Sierra Nevada, have found a cost. So when might you get one? When might you see the other? So some recent work has suggested that there might be this period, maybe in the first few years after a fire, that trees might be more susceptible to drought. And then once kind of all that background mortality has happened, then the survivors are able to take advantage of that thinning effect of fire. So in order to answer these questions, we really first need to have kind of this fundamental understanding of how fire impacts the ability of trees to function. And surprisingly, this is something that we don't really understand that well. And so this is kind of what has motivated a lot of my work. So I'm going to get into a little bit of physiology here. I won't go too much into it, but I think some of these fundamental mechanisms are really important to understand to answer these questions. So I'm going to start out by talking a bit about how fire injuries impact tree function, and then we'll get into the second question of how those injuries kind of affect the degree to which trees can benefit from this fire-caused thinning effect during drought. So we'll start with this first question here. So I'm going to be talking about some work that I've done over the last 4 years at some sites in the Blackfoot Valley in western Montana. These are Douglas-fir and ponderosa pine forests, sites that hadn't had any recent fire. We measured small trees up to about 6 inches in dBH. And we chose those smaller trees just to ensure that we would get some level of crown scorch during what we anticipated to be kind of lower intensity prescribed fires. And then we paired each of these 3 sites with a nearby unburned site that we'll call our control. And the great thing about prescribed fires is they allow for a more experimental approach. So we were able to measure trees pre-fire, and then we followed them for about 2 growing seasons post-fire as well. So to give you an idea of the fire behavior for these burns, so on the left, this first spring burn occurred in April of 2021. This was on University of Montana's Bandy Ranch. This was just ponderosa pine. This was kind of a pilot study that turned out to be much cooler than we were anticipating. And so this was pretty basic, a pretty simple prescribed burn. We just burned off this meadow. These trees were kind of encroaching into the meadow. So very much a surface fire, really quick moving through grass. So the trees didn't really sustain any injuries around the base of them, but we did get some really nice different levels of crown scorch. And then the other 2 burns, one occurred in the fall, October of 2022, and then another one the following spring. These ones were more, I think, realistic conditions. Both ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir. The fall burn was, I think, quite a bit more intense than anticipated. We had some pretty good crown scorch on some pretty big trees. It was fairly windy and warm that day. So definitely not the low intensity surface fire that I was anticipating. But great to see some variability in fire behavior. And then the spring burn was a lot patchier. Green up had started at this site, but still some good pockets of fire behavior. The spring burn was done by aerial ignition, where the other 2 were hand. And so I want to also acknowledge here that the seasonality of fire may interact with tree phenology. So, are those trees dormant when you're burning? Are the buds starting to enlarge? Does that make them more vulnerable to heating effects? And I'll talk a little bit about this in some of these results, but this is, only three burns here. And I should also mention, so my kind of day job is with the Fire Sciences Lab here in Missoula. And we do have some work that is ongoing at the Fire Lab to look at this question at a larger scale. So stay tuned for that. So to think about how fire impacts tree function, we're going to get into a little bit of physiology here. And I want to talk about how fire might impact the ability of trees to take up carbon and also to move it around. So if we come back to one of our examples of fire injuries here, fire scar formation. So for folks that don't think about tree bits all the time like I do, right, we have the outer bark here on the outside. Inside that, there's the phloem, which is really important for the transportation of carbohydrates throughout the tree, right? And carbohydrates do all sorts of things. They're important for growth, reproduction, defense against insects and disease, a whole slew of things. And then on the inside, we have the xylem, and that is primarily important for water transport, so from the roots up to the crown of the tree. And then in between those 2, we have the cambium, right, which is where growth is occurring. So those cells can go on to become new phloem or new xylem. And so if you kill the phloem and the cambium, not only are you preventing new growth from happening, if you kill enough of the phloem, you can disrupt the movement of carbohydrates throughout the tree. So that's what I'm showing here. So this can happen, like I mentioned, around the base of trees. It can happen in branches, and even if you get hot enough, if you get high enough heating around the soil, this can happen in roots as well. So it's disrupting this movement of carbohydrates around the tree to where they're needed. At the same time, like I mentioned, the other factor here is crown scorch, right? So basically this is having a defoliating effect on the tree. And so there's this hypothesis that this should lead to this reduction in leaf area to photosynthesize, should lead to a reduction in carbohydrates, in carbon being assimilated by that tree. And so these are kind of the hypotheses that I went into this work with, and I'll show some data today showing support for them. But this is really important because this kind of carbon balance that a tree has is really important. Those reserves, you can think of them as like a bank account for that tree. So during periods of stress, those reserves are really important. Those carbohydrate reserves are important for, like I mentioned, defense against insects and disease, growth of new tissues. Soluble sugars, which are a type of carbohydrate, are important for drought tolerance. And if you have less carbon to support, for example, fine roots, then that could have implications for water uptake for that tree, which might be really important under drought. And then also for post-fire growth. And so we can measure these carbohydrates in trees. We call them non-structural carbohydrates. These are just sugars and starches, pretty basic. You can think of them as just the tree's carbon reserves. So we can measure these in any tissue in the trees. And so this is a picture of me sampling from the base of one of our trees before we burned. But what do we see? So I'm going to first show some results from this first burn that we did in 2021. This was just ponderosa pine. On the y-axis, I have these non-structural carbohydrates. So all you really need to know here, higher values, more stores, healthier tree, lower values, less healthy. And then on the x-axis, we have the different time steps. So that with the red line representing the time of that burn. So we measure these trees beforehand, and we have three groups here. Where in blue, we have the controls. So these are unburned trees. In the black, those are trees that were alive when we sampled them, but went on to die. And then in the white, we have these surviving trees. So trees that were burned, but were still alive at the end of our study. And so we can see that in the first few days post-burning, this is about 4 days post-burning, we don't see any changes. But by about 3 weeks post-fire, we start to see this differentiation occur. And by 2 months post-fire, these differences become even stronger. So the unburned trees, they're increasing their carbon stores. This is what happens during the spring. So are the trees that were burned but survived to some degree, but the trees that went on to die seem to be decreasing. And by the end of that first summer after fire, we see that pattern is still holding. This fluctuation is just the seasonal fluctuation that is normal. And then by the second season, so this was the second season after burning, the following June and the following September, we see that the survivors seem to be at fairly similar levels to the unburned trees, so suggesting that recovery has happened. And by this time, all of the trees that were going to die had died. And we see a really similar pattern after the other two prescribed burns, and for both ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir. The data from the other two burns weren't quite as beautiful looking as these ones, but I think maybe a more realistic scenario. And I think the reason this is so clear is, like I mentioned, there was really no injury to these trees around the base. It was just crown scorch that they sustained. But that could be true for a lot of mature trees that have much thicker bark, if we're thinking about prescribed burning conditions. But the thing that stood out is that after all three of these burns, we see that the trees that went on to die are decreasing in their stored carbohydrates, whereas the unburned trees have this highest level, and the trees that survive but were burned are kind of this intermediate level. And so why might that be happening? Why is there that variability? We see that it's strongly related to crown scorch here. So here I'm showing carbohydrates again on the y-axis, and now I have crown scorch on the x-axis. And so what we see is that, for example, trees that are dying in the black, they have both high crown scorch and low carbohydrates. And there's this really nice relationship between these two. So I was really excited about this. And what's so interesting is that we know that crown scorch is a really good predictor of delayed post-fire mortality, particularly for a species like ponderosa pine. And so I think what we're seeing here is this mechanistic link between these things, which I think is really important in order to be able to make better predictions about post-fire mortality. And so it seems like this loss of photosynthetic leaf area really is important for these trees. But what about the other two burns? So the second spring burn that we did in May of 2023, we see similar patterns here. So on the left is ponderosa pine again, and very similar pattern with the trees that ended up dying, having both high crown scorch and low carbohydrates. A similar pattern for Douglas-fir, although the trees that are dying are not quite as nicely clustered. And interestingly, when we look at the patterns for the trees that were burned in the fall, for ponderosa pine, a similar relationship overall. Douglas-fir, not so much. So I think what this is saying here, like I mentioned, these burns were much more realistic conditions. Crown scorch, also some injuries around the base of trees. So maybe those basal injuries are important, and maybe this crown scorch link isn't the whole story. And so what else could be going on? So if we come back to these hypotheses about how fire impacts tree carbon balance, if we think about these like fire scar injuries, whether they're around the base or they're in branches or in roots, I think one thing that might be going on, and we see some data for this that I'm not going to go into, but if you have questions about it, I'm happy to answer those at the end. But if those trees are making new carbohydrates in their crown, but there's all these areas where the phloem is dead, remember that's really important for the transportation of these carbohydrates, then it's not able to move around that kind of currency that it needs to sustain all these other functions. So for example, what I'm showing here is, I think that this might be resulting in fine roots dying off. And so we see some data that suggests that right before these trees die, they seem to be experiencing high water stress. So not right after the burning, but like longer term, as their carbohydrates start to dip, they also seem to be experiencing water stress. So I think that might be what's going on. And that could be really important during drought. At the same time, we see really good evidence that this reduction in leaf area is also important, and that overall trees with this really strong depletion of carbohydrates, those are the ones that are dying. And so, like I mentioned before, this is really important, possibly for if there's less carbon to support fine roots, which is important for water uptake and also post-fire growth. So if we come back to the second question now, I think we can answer this one a little bit better. So how those injuries and their impacts affect the degree to which this thinning effect of fire can actually benefit tree water status and growth. So I'm going to be talking about just the second two burns for this next portion. We did this rain exclusion experiment where we put out these shelters around the base of trees. So we did this with half of our steady trees. So that's just my steady design I'm showing here. So half of the Douglas-fir and half of the ponderosa pine at both our burn site and the unburned control site. And we put these shelters out in late May of 2023, so about 3 weeks after the spring prescribed fire and a few months after the fall prescribed fire. And we left those up through September of 2024. And then at various points in time, we measured both water stress and water availability. We quantified changes in competition around these focal trees. And we did that we quantified this Hedgie index, which is just a competition index that takes into consideration both the diameter of neighbor trees and the distance to that focal tree within a specific radius. I'll also show data for stand density index for folks that think about that more often. And then finally, we also measured radial growth. So we took tree cores from the surviving trees, and we took sections from the trees that had died in September of 2024. We also had the opportunity on a portion of our trees to measure more fine scale growth via these dendrometers. So we just had these on ponderosa pine, but there's basically like a spring that is loaded against the inner bark of the tree, and so it's measuring the outward growth of the tree over time. But also, what's really cool about these is that it can measure kind of the diurnal fluctuation of as trees move water throughout the day. So, right, as during the daytime, trees are photosynthesizing, they're losing water, and so that tree shrinks. And then overnight, as it refills, that tree swells. And so we have this kind of up and down trajectory of growth throughout the day. And from that, we can measure this water deficit of these trees. So I want to start first by just showing how competition changed at these sites. So on the y-axis here, I have this neighborhood competition index. The fall burn is on the top, the spring burn is on the bottom, and then the unburned controls are on the right. And we have both pre and post burn shown here. So no changes in the controls, which is what we would expect. But significant decreases in competition for both burn sites. And actually, contrary to what I was expecting to see based on fire behavior, by the end of the study, the spring burn had actually experienced greater decreases in competition than the fall burn, despite the fall burn being higher intensity. And we did see quite a bit of delayed mortality at the spring burn site, and I have some ideas about why that might be. It's hard to say from just two sites. If it's a thing that has to do with the seasonality of burning, or it was something that was specific to the site. The site was a bit rockier. I think there may have been more root damage at that site that may have resulted in kind of slow death over time for a number of those trees. So, but what you need to take away from here is that we do see changes in competition. These changes aren't huge. So if you think about stand density index, these sites are going from fairly high density for ponderosa pine to moderate density, with kind of this target being lower density for ponderosa pine of less than 110, and approaching that at the fall site, but less so at the spring site. So competition changed, not hugely, but probably on par with what you would expect from a prescribed burn. So what does this mean for water status? Are these trees, do they have more water, or are the injuries kind of outweighing those impacts? So we see pretty clear evidence. I'm showing this total water deficit, which was measured from our dendrometers on the y-axis and time on the x. The fall burn is on the top, the spring burn is on the bottom. And then the burn trees are in orange here. So we see across the board higher total water deficit in these burn trees. So I think this is really interesting that it was so consistent for both sites. We do see some evidence at the spring burn site, but that by the second growing season post-fire, that those trees, those burn trees that are still alive, appear to be recovered to about the same levels as the control. So perhaps this is just a temporary effect. But what about the drought? What about our experimental drought? What impact did that play? Oh, and I should mention that we took some discrete measurements of water stress and water availability as well, and they line up with this. I'm not going to show those data here, but really similar patterns where the burn trees generally had higher water stress and were having a more difficult time accessing soil water. So recall that we did this drought experiment where we put out these rain exclusion shelters. And so same figure here, but now I have trees broken up by trees that were droughted and those that were not in the ambient. And so what I want to draw your attention to here is that in the kind of tan color, those are burn trees that we droughted. And they clearly have the highest total water deficit for the fall burn here. And I have the second growing season post-fire outlined in red here. So we can see this time period where this really matters. Interestingly, we didn't see this pattern as much for the spring burn site. And I have some thoughts about why that might be. The spring burn site was a fair amount steeper. And so I think we may have had some issues with kind of upslope infiltration of rainwater and snowmelt into the footprint of these drought shelters. But what is also interesting is that, so I'm showing data here for just trees that survived. But if we include trees that went on to die, we see a similar pattern. So the fall burn trees, that difference between the burned droughted trees becomes even stronger. And we see that at least during the growing season, that seems to be the case for the spring burn trees as well. So this is suggesting that burn trees may be more vulnerable to post-fire drought. So what does this all mean for growth? So like I mentioned, we took tree cores and sections from these trees. And so what I'm showing here is this metric of radial growth, basal area increment, so higher values, higher growth, for about 5 years pre-fire. The red line is the year of the fire. Got ponderosa pine on the left, Douglas-fir on the right, and then the fall burn on the top, spring burn on the bottom. And the burn sites are all in red, the red lines here. And so what we see is that from the year prior to the fire to the first growing season post-fire, there's this big decline. And this is, what I would expect to see. Other studies that have used tree cores to look at longer term growth post-fire often see a similar effect in that first year post-fire. But then we also start to see that bounce back, so that recovery the second year post-fire. And we see that in particular for the spring burn trees that seem to be bouncing back to about the same levels, or perhaps in the case of Douglas-fir here, even higher levels than the unburned control trees. So suggesting that recovery may be happening fairly quickly at those sites. So what specifically is causing this growth decline? So we see that this growth decline seems to be really strongly related to crown scorch. So here I'm showing this resistance metric on the y-axis, and all you need to know about this is it relates to that decline in growth from the year pre-fire to the first year post-fire. So if you have lower resistance, that's a bigger arrow. That black arrow there is bigger, so a stronger decrease in growth. And so we see that trees that have high levels of crown scorch have these stronger decreases in growth associated with fire. We also see that there's some differences in terms of species to some degree. We saw that tree size is important in this growth decline, as well as carbon balance as well. But when we look at that kind of growth bounce back the following year, so this recovery of growth, we see no relationship with crown scorch. And what we see is that this recovery is more strongly, although not not very nicely, but significantly related to changes in competition. So on average, trees that had stronger decreases in competition around them had more recovery in that second year post-fire. And I think, like I mentioned, the competition decreases were not huge at these sites. So I think if we had a bigger spread in levels, in changes in competition, we might see a stronger relationship here. Or if we looked at a longer recovery period than just 1 year post fire, that this relationship might get stronger. And then finally, we looked at this growth resilience metric. So this is just the degree to which trees bounce back to their pre-fire levels in that second year post-fire. And so we see that resilience is also really strongly related to crown scorch and tree carbon balance as well. And so I think the takeaway here is that trees may not be able to benefit from this reduced competition until they recover from their injuries. And, this is just, I just did this work over the length of a PhD. I would love to follow these trees for longer to see, to better understand more about that recovery period. But fortunately, I have some data to show from some ongoing work at the Fire Sciences Lab, so where I have my day job. This is some work that I've been doing there, looking at longer term trends in growth after fire. So on the y-axis, we have radial growth again. On the x-axis, we have time. And this is from a site right outside of Missoula, really similar site to the prescribed burn sites, both ponderosa pine and Douglas-fir. And then we have the different colors that relate to the levels of crown scorch that these trees sustained. So with the red being high crown scorch, that's greater than 60% of the crown scorched. And then in the gray, we have a kind of an unburned site as a reference. And so what we see here is really similarly to what I saw in the prescribed burn work, is that trees with the highest level of crown scorch, they seem to be experiencing the strongest decline in growth associated with fire. And those with low crown scorch, so that's about, I believe it's lower than 30% crown scorch, that decrease is a lot less. And in addition to that, it seems like if you look, for example, at ponderosa pine, by year 4 post-fire, all of the trees from the burned site are growing faster than the unburned site. So they seem to be realizing that benefit that comes from less competition, for example, from water. But the degree of fire injury that they sustain seems to be affecting that recovery time. So where the trees with low crown scorch, they seem to bounce back much quicker than the trees with high crown scorch. And in the case of Douglas-fir, which are, they can typically sustain less, or they can typically withstand less crown scorch than ponderosa pine because of their smaller buds. That those trees with high crown scorch are never really able to realize that benefit of reduced competition. So stay tuned for this project. It's very much just in the data analysis phase right now. We have a bunch more sites. So I'm hoping to look at not only how this recovery period relates to crown injuries and changes in competition, but also perhaps site productivity or post-fire climate. I think those could be really important. But overall, I think what we can say here is that both that initial effect of fire on growth and the recovery period seem to relate to fire injuries. So to wrap up here, coming back to this first question of more fundamentally how fire impacts tree function, I think we can say that this depletion in these carbon stores is really tightly linked to the degree of crown scorch, but also if trees can't make enough new carbohydrates or they can't move them around to maintain the function of their different tissues or defense against insects and disease, then those trees may die in the post-fire period. And like I mentioned, this could have consequences if trees are not able to supply enough carbohydrates to support their fine roots. This could have consequences for water uptake, which is really important during drought. And then to get at the second question, I think that we can say that there's likely this period of increased vulnerability to drought post-fire, and that during this kind of recovery period, that the changes in competition, that is less important during this period. And that this growth reduction is both temporary but clearly related to the degree of crown scorch. And like I mentioned, that that degree of injury that they sustain might also influence the recovery time that these trees need before they're able to realize that benefit from reduced competition. And so I think if we're managing our forests, if the goal is to decrease drought vulnerability or increase resilience to drought, I think some things that should be considered are how we can both decrease competition and also minimize crown injuries. So obviously this is going to depend on the species, but trees can withstand some crown scorch, and ponderosa pine can withstand quite a bit and still bounce back just fine. But one way that this can be that we can adjust the level of crown scorch might be by pre-fire thinning. So you have less intense fire when that site is burned while still reducing competition, or repeated burning. Over time, we could have the same effect where a stand is thinned to a degree that the trees might be able to benefit from increased water availability, but also minimizing the level of fire injuries that they sustain. All right, and I just want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work. So Sharon Hood at the Fire Lab, Ana Sala, my advisor, and then a collaborator at Reed College, Aaron Ramirez. And I also want to really thank the folks at the Missoula BLM field office, Michael Alberton and Dan Poole, who have been incredible supporters of this work and allowed me to do my science in their prescribed burn areas, and are also great about inviting me out to burn with them. I always learn a lot when I get out in the field with them, so I really appreciate that. With that, I will take questions and leave you with this cool time series showing the development of crown scorch and recovery for ponderosa pine after a prescribed fire. And I've put up my University of Montana email address. I will be finishing up my PhD here in May. So I don't know how much longer I'll have access to that email. So I've included my Forest Service email on here as well. All right, and I think I have to stop sharing in order to see the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and do that.
Thank you, Charlotte. That's such
Great.
cool work.
Thank you.
Let me see. Christine, I see you have your hand up. Let me see if I can go in and let you talk. There it is. Okay, Christine, you should be able to come off of mute and ask your question.
I'm not hearing anything.
Yeah, we're not hearing you, Christine.
They don't have audio permissions.
Yeah. Oh, I gave her audio permission, but I think it's still not working. So there's a couple questions in the Q&A, and then there's one in the chat as well.
Great. So it looks like the first question in the Q&A is just about including any links shared in the chat with everyone when the recording is shared. The second question is asking, have you had much increase of pest infiltration on the sites that may have caused more stress or mortality in recently burned units? So not really. So these were fairly small trees. So the primary bark beetles that affect these trees really just affect larger diameter trees. So that was kind of a way of taking out that factor. But we do see some red turpentine beetle around the base of some of the ponderosa pine at these sites. But those don't typically kill trees post fire. Although we can't discount the fact that that may have increased stress as well. But that's very much a concern for larger diameter trees, right? And so I think that, for example, if trees have fewer reserves in terms of these carbohydrates, which are really important for things like making defense compounds, I think that could definitely be the reason that we often see trees being more affected by insects and disease immediately post fire as well. All right, we've got another question. Did you notice any impacts of post-fire stand density on recovery time of the surviving trees? Yeah, so unfortunately, with this work, I don't really think, because I only have 2 years post-fire. It's hard to really answer that question with the data that I have. But for that kind of last project that I showed, showing longer term recovery after that wildfire, I think that we'll be able to answer that question. So we have changes in stand density associated with the fire, and we'll be able to say how that relates to recovery time more specifically for that work. So stay tuned for that. I hope to have that project wrapped up here in the next 6 months to a year, if things go according to plan.
Awesome. And then in the chat, um, Carrie asked, I think you mentioned this, but did you only take these measurements on small diameter trees? If so, any ideas about how these results might differ in larger or older trees?
Yep. Yep. So this is definitely a question that I've had a number of people ask. So it's a great question. I think that if anything, the impacts on larger trees are probably less. I think that, I mean, especially after wildfire and sometimes after prescribed fire as well, right? We can see pretty high crown scorch on trees. And similar to what we saw on our smaller diameter trees. So I think that the effects from crown scorch in terms of reducing those carbon stores, I think that that is going to hold no matter what size diameter or what size class of tree that you're looking at. In terms of the effect that might happen from the fire injury or the fire scar formation, I think that might be less of an impact once you have thicker bark, if it's a species that develops thicker bark as it gets older. But I mean, overall, if, for example, in prescribed fire, if you have larger diameter trees that have higher crowns and you're not getting high enough you're not getting intense enough fire behavior to have high levels of crown scorch, I think that then those impacts from those injuries are, they're just a lot less. Those trees are going to be able to bounce back a lot quicker than the trees in this study. Okay, we got another question in the Q&A. So considering the data available, are there concerns or prescription suggestions for using prescribed fire for maintenance on thinning units? I mean, I think that's actually the most ideal situation there, where you have units that have been thinned. So that alone is going to minimize crown scorch. And uh, water availability has already been increased from the thinning. So yeah, I think that's an ideal scenario there. I think that the only thing to consider is that, depending on the level of fire injury that you see on those trees, you can expect the more severe that is, the probably the longer that period that those trees need to recover. But if crown scorch is pretty low, then you know within a year or two, I think that those trees are actually just continuing to benefit from the further any kind of further thinning that happens from fire and all the other benefits that come with prescribed burning. Yeah, no
Awesome.
problem.
So from the chat, so Christine was wondering about that last picture, the time series of scorch that
Yeah.
you showed. I'm wondering about, I think, why it didn't show as much scorch right away. And
Yeah.
then Carrie sort of tacked on to like followed up to that to Christine's question of like, at what time step did you measure ground scorch?
Yeah, great questions. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't think about, if you're not, going out a lot after burns and seeing the crown scorch develop. So it takes a few days for crown scorch to develop post fire. So that first picture I showed was from about 3 days post fire. And so you see like some discoloration happening, but it can be really hard to tell crown scorch in that first week or so post fire. And it really takes a week or two to develop. So when we measured it, it was about 2 or 3 weeks post fire when we actually went out and quantified crown scorch. And it can be really hard to see unless you look at these trees a lot and really develop an eye for it. But it can be really hard to quantify until about 2 weeks post fire. And then the last picture I showed where they're recover, that was at the end of the first growing season post fire. So these are all ponderosa pine. Most of the buds survived. They were able to flush out new needles that first spring after the burn. Hopefully that answered the question.
Awesome. And then David asks in the chat, were any of your study sites areas that were mechanically thinned prior to prescribed burning?
Yep. So the only one that had been mechanically thinned was the fall burn, but that was about 20 years ago. So not really. I mean, I would have ideally liked sites that hadn't been thinned at all. So I tried to select trees in areas that had a variable density. So that site had kind of taller, mature overstory trees, and then these kind of clusters of regenerating trees in the understory that hadn't been thinned. And so I was trying to minimize that effect. I would love to do something like this with more of an experimental approach that includes a thin and burn treatment as well. So stay tuned for the future. All right, there's another question in the Q&A I can read. Was there a specific percentage of stand mortality where you really started to see beneficial recovery in the surviving trees? So again, it's hard to say from just uh, the short time period that I follow these trees post fire. I think that this larger project that I mentioned that I have ongoing at the fire lab will get at that question a little bit better. So we can say, because those trees were followed for the first 3 years post fire, we can see what percentage of them died and when we start to see that benefit. So hard to answer with the shorter time frame that I have for my dissertation work, but I think I will be able to answer that question a little bit better with this longer term data set.
Awesome. There's been some really great questions. We have just a couple of minutes. I know people are starting to leave. Oh, hey, we have another question. Go ahead.
Great. Okay, great. Have you also considered using relative density, so stand density index divided by SDI max, to determine the level of crowding and competition in the stands? No, it's a great thing to consider, and I will definitely consider that. I'm working on a manuscript of this work right now, and maybe that might be something that I can think about more with this longer term data set of growth as well. So thanks for that suggestion.
Awesome. We have time for maybe one more question if anybody has a last burning question. And then also, let me just plug a final reminder. I've put the post-webinar survey link in the chat. If everybody takes just a second to fill that out, I will be eternally grateful. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much to everybody who joined us on this, at least here, rather rainy Monday. And thank you so much, Charlotte,
Thank
for
you.
presenting this really interesting work. Um, I can't wait to see the final analysis once you'll publish it.
Great. So thank you so much, and really great questions. I appreciate those. Feel free to reach out if anyone has other questions.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care.